Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. I'm your host, Killian, managing editor for Being Libertarian LLC, which includes BeingLibertarian.com, Think-Liberty.com, RationalStandard.com, and of course, Champion Books, which does have its inaugural book out, Igniting Liberty, Voices for Freedom Around the World. If you haven't gotten a copy, I've plugged this week after week after week. If you haven't gotten a copy, at this point, I'm disappointed in you. I kid. But it's definitely a great read, and I do suggest getting a copy if and when you can. As always, even though I said I'm going to stop doing the as always thing because I've been caught on that a few times. But anyway, we'll just ignore it for now. We're just going to continue. You can follow us on all forms of social media. You can follow myself directly by searching Killian Hobbs Author on Facebook there. You can listen to our podcasts wherever you get your podcasts. And with all that said and done, we're going to roll right into today's episode. We're continuing on with the series of guests that I've had on to talk about specific thinkers, philosophers, political commentary, so on and so forth. This week, we're going to be talking about John Stuart Mill. And today I have Luke Henderson joining me. Luke, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
It's a pleasure to have you on, Luke. For those of you who aren't aware of Luke, Luke here is, you got quite a few different hats there. He's one of the co-authors of Igniting Liberty. He's our marketing editor, so he's the one that helps out behind the scenes, making sure that a whole bunch of content comes up for the book, helping to push the website stuff, basically helping the stuff that we have get in front of you in a more efficient way. And he's also, along with previous guests that you might remember, Donald Keller, part of the Libertarian Coalition. I believe I did mention Luke on that episode as well. So for today, he's going to be joining me to talk about John Stuart Mill. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with his work, there's quite a bit that he wrote. He jumped around in a lot of different areas, but primarily he focused on classical liberal writings. So a lot of really basic foundational things. I mean, if you haven't read On Liberty, then you're really just depriving yourself. I'm going to say that. It's a very short read, and you don't need to be particularly academic or already involved in libertarian circles or in just the concept of liberty itself to really grasp his work. And it's very, like I said, foundational. So if you come across a lot of the later writers that talk about liberty, it's good to know where a lot of these ideas really sprang from and some of the key arguments that they were based on. So I'm going to hand things over to Luke here a little bit. Luke, why don't you tell me a little bit more about the key arguments of On Liberty?
Of course. This is one of my favorite books of John Stuart Mill because I think, for one thing, the biggest thing is just he talks about the exchange of ideas and how if you are not concerned with someone refuting your idea, then you should want to talk to people about it. You should want people to argue about it and try to refute it over and over again, because it's really only the authoritarians who want to prevent people from trying to disprove their ideas because they think it'll harm it more than anything. But like I said, On Liberty is just there's a lot in it, but it's a very succinct book. So there's so many things just on that book we could talk about. We could probably go over a whole hour just on that book alone.
Yeah, which is, it's funny how impactful he was in such few words. I mean, ignoring the massive impact he had philosophically and just generally ideologically, his ability as a writer was excessively impressive as well. I mean, he was, going into the history of the man a bit, he was basically a prodigy and was raised as such, and then he sort of branched away from what had become the standard or prevailing thoughts to really dig into these concepts of liberty. I mean, he was one of the first people to really rail against racism. He was one of the first people to talk about inclusionary things for women. He was centuries ahead of his time when it came to how foundational he thought the concept of liberty was. You touched on the idea aspect and the free exchange of ideas. One of my favorite quotes of his is, and I'm unfortunately paraphrasing it because I can't remember the exact point of it right now. For those of you that are unaware, this is about 11:30 on a Monday that we're recording this, so it's been a bit of a long day. So do forgive me for getting the quote a little bit wrong here. But in the quote, he states that to deprive the world of a single voice of dissonance is to deprive the world of all of them. So in that quote, he's basically explaining that if you can find justification for silencing the different ideas or the eccentricities or the different notions of a single person, then, why not two? Why not five? Why not 10? Why not 1,000? Why not the entire population except for one person? And it really nails home how important the thoughts and ideas and contributions of the individual are to the entirety of society. Now, I guess another thing I'd bring up here with you, Luke, would be this is one that I think I would like to get a second opinion on, because I might have interpreted it a little bit wrong when I was first reading it. But what would you say was his take on the concept of social duty?
His take's kind of hard to figure out, I think, on times at that, because he also wrote, utilitarianism, because that's primarily what his father believed, and because he's a utilitarian and he's an empiricist. So social duty was one of the things that I think was really hard to pin down with him, because he's very exploratory in his writing. Like, he's always considering what other people, to emulate what he says about the free exchange of ideas, he's always considering what other people say about his ideas. But in general, I think, like, his idea of social duty is basically, like, you should want to help out your fellow man, but you're not necessarily required to, and you shouldn't necessarily be required to by law. Like, whenever I read him, I always get a lot of echoes. Like, this reminds me of Max Stirner and, like, egoistic philosophies. And then, like, when I look it up, I was like, oh, Max actually wrote this before John Stuart Mill. I thought it was the other way around. But just that kind of thing, just because of his empiricism and his focus on liberty, it's really hard to pin down his thoughts on social duty.
Yeah, and I have to agree with that too, because when I read through it, I see he talks about the concept of social duty, and similar to what you said, I looked at it from, okay, so this is in line with his utilitarian arguments of what, a person needs to do to contribute to society, but then sometimes he would branch out in small little chunks here and there into things that seemed kind of counterproductive to his overall view on liberty, but then he would loop it back by saying these social duties can't impede the individual. They exist, they should be followed, and other people can act in accordance to whether or not a person follows them, but they don't have to be followed. And it's a funny thing that you mentioned Stirner, because that's one of those things that I really appreciated with Mills, was the fact that he mentioned social duty, or I'm going to take it broad scale and just say these concepts of social constructs, if you will, these different ideas of relations in society and that type of expectation that comes from living in a populated area. But he acknowledged the distinction between you don't have to follow it. However, there are established norms. However, there is a level of expectation to be had there, and other people are going to have that. And I like that, because one of the biggest issues that I find, and I don't know if maybe you see this differently than I do, I'll ask you about this a little bit after, but one of the biggest issues I find in a lot of general philosophy, not even just in the libertarian or liberty sphere, but general philosophy, is that once you get too far into some of the subjectivity arguments, you start to face that question of, okay, but who cares? You get to that question of, okay, well, if everything is whatever you want it to be, or if everything is subjective and comes down to the person, then why does any of the backbone of this stuff matter? And I like that Mills approached it by saying it matters because everyone is accustomed to it, believes in it, and it leads towards a social good.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's highly influenced just by him being utilitarian, because, his views are always going to be influenced by what brings the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest amount of people. So that though you want the most free option in a society, he argues, that that's not necessarily the best option, because it doesn't necessarily bring the most happiness to the best amount of people. Like, that's why I really think libertarians should read on liberty, but also read utilitarianism. And if they're not going to read the whole book, at least read chapter 5, because that whole chapter talks about his views on what is justice and does justice fit in with the utilitarian framework. And he basically comes to the conclusion that it's really hard to say something is just, but also causes the great amount of happiness for the greatest amount of people, because he concludes that justice is basically just wanting to, get something in exchange for your wrongdoing, almost a sort of type of revenge in all cases. Which, if you're reading that without all his explanation, you're like, well, wait, that's not right. Justice isn't revenge. Like, that's unjust. But the way he explains it, it just really makes you think, like, okay, these issues aren't as black and white as you would think.
Mm-hmm. Now, you touched on it a bit here, and I guess we'll transition from on liberty over to utilitarianism a bit here, because, like you mentioned before, we could spend hours going through just each section in that book. When it comes to his view on utilitarianism, obviously he put forth the argument that, whatever causes the greatest amount of happiness for the most amount of people, that is the greater good. But how do we define the kind of happiness that he was working with as a general frame? Was he talking about just general personal well-being and, psychic happiness, or was he talking about something a little more refined? Because I find the utilitarian argument could very well transition itself into almost hedonistic arguments, but I found that he sort of avoided that. I mean, maybe you can elaborate a little bit better than I can on that front.
No, yeah, for sure. Like I like his view of utilitarianism because it's a little more developed and he goes a little bit further along the line. Like, one of the things he says that, utilitarian morality does recognize that we have to sacrifice for the greatest good of others, but it doesn't necessarily recognize that the sacrifice in itself is good, because the sacrifice doesn't necessarily increase the total sum of happiness, but if it does, like, that's great. So, like, he gets really in the weeds with utilitarianism, more so than I think that his father or John Bentham did, which is really great. And then he takes it even more into other realms, like, how does utilitarianism affect human nature? It's like he thinks human nature is more of a development of course of time, which I think makes sense, him being utilitarianism, and utilitarians tend to be more empirical, as opposed to human nature being like a set thing that just everyone follows, or that everyone's going to have to try to either reject or accept.
And it's interesting that you branched off there into some of the natural law stuff. I find that's I find his take on that very interesting. Now, I mean, there's a fair bit of it that you can find disagreements with in a lot of later philosophers once they've had the chance to really, really digest the idea. But I mean, even if you come across one of the arguments that counters it, to think of some of the ways that these were actually laid down and observed and set, the kind of brain power that he put towards this, I think, even if you can, disagree with parts of it, I think is phenomenal. I consider some of his arguments, because it's no secret that I lean towards anarchy on certain things, whereas him, being more of a classic liberal, understood that there was a certain role for the state to play in the interactions of people, that as minimal as it should be, there is a set of roles that it can embody, and it needs to embody those for the sake of the greater good, was his argument. And, like I said, with my anarchist leanings, I would disagree with that a little bit. But what I have to appreciate with him is how consistent he was in the application of his ideas. I mean, it obviously stems from the core belief that liberty is a positive thing. Maximizing happiness on a broad scale is a endeavor that's worth establishing things for and worth working from. And it's from those beliefs that he set up a very fluid type of argumentation. Now, I mean, not just from his ideas themselves, but how would you describe Mill's argumentation style?
It really depends on the book. Like, on the subjection of women, he kind of goes just by topic to topic, and I think goes more broadly to a little more refined. Like, he starts with, at first, just on the subjection of women. He says that, like married women are almost worse than slaves, because slaves at least have the ability to own property if they get permission from their masters, but a woman, anything she owns is never going to be hers. And then he just kind of narrows that down and down to, he goes from, okay, this is then marriage, because marriage is a little less broad, but everyone at that time was going through marriage. Then he goes to politics, and so he narrows it down even more. So I think that's in general his argumentation style. He starts very broadly and then starts to narrow it down. But like on liberty, he almost contradicts himself, I think, from the first half to the second half of the book, because then he starts like trying to refute or answer the refutations to his own arguments, and I agree. But I think overall that's his style. Start very big and then narrow it down.
And you see, that's something that that's the approach that I've always liked. I like it when a writer is able to spit their idea out rather than having to take 40 pages to get a very simple concept that could be summarized in 2 sentences. When they can simplify their idea, spit it out, and then start breaking down all their reasoning for backing it up, I find that that's the most effective, because at least they know where you're going with your argumentation. There's some writers where when you're going through their work, you have to get through almost a third of it before you start to realize what they're actually trying to accomplish. Mills, on the other hand, had a much more, like you mentioned before, a much more succinct style. He was much more direct in the way that he said, okay, here's what it looks like. This is what I'm arguing for. This is why I believe it. Let's go through what I could be wrong on. Here's possible refutations. Here's how I could be wrong. Here's why I'm not. Next topic. And there's something about the almost, I feel like I'm using the word incorrectly. Not incorrectly. It just doesn't seem to have the right weight to it for this, but it's almost poetic the way that his writing flows. There's definitely a rhythm to it that you don't necessarily see in a lot of, I guess you could say, a lot of drier writing that you might come across from, say, some of the more economically minded writers like Mises or Rothbard. There isn't really a poetics to the writing at that point. There's nothing that draws you in as a reader, not just as a person looking to analyze the ideas, but as a person who's actually wanting to read something from that perspective. If I'm making sense here, if I'm not, tell me. I might be off on the left field here, but
no, you definitely
this
are.
is something that I've always appreciated with his style, is that it's an enjoyable read and it brings you into his mind, which is what a writer should always be aiming for.
Yeah, and coming from a more musical background, like I think I see it even more when I read Mill, because like for example, like in the classical tradition, when we're trying to write a song for like a more operatic style or that, we're always trying to look for like, how does this phrase sound when you say it? So then we can see really which words need to be emphasized and which syllables need to be shorter. And so that's what I kind of also feel with John Stuart Mill's style. Like his writing really reflects, I think, how this would be spoken if this were to be a speech read to a person. But that also means that his sentences sometimes can be very long. There's lots of commas. Sometimes his paragraphs can be pages long. But like you said, there's kind of a poetry to it, because I think he wrote this as he would tell another person, not necessarily like trying to convey an idea from one intellectual to another, but how he would tell the common man if I had to just read this book to somebody, because Lord knows books were a lot more expensive to make in his time.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. It's written, almost all of his works are written in the format of a speech. They're not written for high academia. They're written to be shared and spoken amongst the people so that they can understand these concepts and work with them. Flipping around here a little bit here. Since you're very well versed when it comes to a lot of the stuff regarding Mills here. If there was any sort of arguments that he made that you find yourself having, digested the works of other writers, what would you say are some arguments of his that you disagree with, if any?
I think the biggest thing is on liberty. It's just that one section that I think everyone gets him for, where he makes the exception for barbarians not receiving the same liberty as everyone else. Because I truly feel that liberty is for everyone, even if they're not a quote unquote civilized society, or they don't exactly, have the same technologies or exhibit the same moralities, I still think they still deserve their liberty at that point. And so it's just that section is just kind of very abrupt. All of a sudden, it's like, he's making these like, oh, governments, the only thing they should be doing is to prevent harm. The only reason someone should be infringing on everyone's liberty is to not is because theirs is being infringed on. And then it's like, but the barbarians.
Yeah. You see, I kind of understood it in a bit of a different lens. He was using, I suppose, actual barbarians as the example, but when I read that, I kind of read it as almost an opponents to liberty sort of thing. So people who would undo the type of society that fosters liberty for the individual. And I still disagree with it. I'm like you on that one, where either liberty is for everybody or it's not liberty. You can't have equal rights for some or people more equal than others. It's a contradiction. It does not work.
And it's just really confusing because, like you said, like he was one of the first to say, like, hey, women should be able to vote. They should be able to hold office. Hey, slavery and this, the racism coming is wrong. But it's just that one little tick mark in there. And just to not necessarily go too far on another philosopher, it was interesting because I'm reading right now one of Foucault's books, and he talks about barbarians versus savages. And he says basically that the barbarian is just kind of someone who goes against the established social contract society. So like you said, it could be that he just meant a barbarian, someone's against liberty, someone is going against what the society established, which would be in line with Mill's views because he's not anti-government. He's not doesn't want a state to be gone necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he still advocated for the existence of a state to help keep things in check against people's baser natures in case the majority of the population decided to incline themselves to baser natures. And I think that does tie into some of his views on the barbarian side of things. But again, that's kind of where you start to see the division between classical liberals, minarchists, and anarchists, right?
Yeah.
You see it on that kind of line of what's acceptable or what is necessary for the overall goals that they have in mind. And I find that a lot of people that found themselves more on the utilitarian side, whether they were specifically utilitarians or if they just happened to be utilitarians, so like people who advocated for greater good concepts, but prior to the real foundational works on utilitarianism, because it's not necessarily a new idea, and it wasn't a new idea at the time, but it really started to get codified with both his father and through him. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you are with his personal history, but what type of an impact do you think that some of these ideas had when it came to his role in the state?
I mean, at the time, I think just people were, especially in England, were a little more moving towards more free markets and all that, because all this is kind of what leads up to where we start having policies like in the United States and Europe about breaking up monopolies and all that, because we have the Industrial Revolution and people are starting to think that, so much of this business in the hands of such a few people, and our working conditions kind of suck. Our children have to work. We got to do something about this. So I think Mill's really inspired that, but then what also kind of leads up until we start getting more state regulation of that because people think they're getting the short end of the stick because of this philosophy.
Mm-hmm. And I think when it comes to, like I said, when it comes to Mill's work, one of the things that I do like with him is the fact that even though I do disagree with the state aspect, as I've mentioned before, I can appreciate the reasoning that he argued for it and the method that he used to argue for it. I mean, even if you go through some of the other stuff that he worked on, because he did do some work on actual systems of logic, where he started to join in the debates on scientific method. Trying to remember the people that were involved. I think it was William Whewell and I can't remember the name of the other person, but I know that at that time he developed what he had called Mill's methods. How familiar are you with those?
I have not gotten to that one yet. I don't believe.
Yeah, those were in his book System of Logic, and in that he starts talking about things like the direct method of agreement, methods of difference. It's, I'd probably say, a great precursor to some of his other works. And again, you can enjoy his other works and find great arguments in them without having to read through that. But it really breaks down some of the systemic work that he did in the background to build up his own arguments for the type of presentation style he has with his equal rights work on liberty, utilitarianism, his concept of the harm principle, which I'm sure many people now would better refer to as the NAP.
Mm-hmm.
And he was talking about it, about 150 years before it actually became, more codified in libertarian circles. It's one of those things where a lot of the ideas that he was bringing forward, you also have to keep in mind the time that these ideas were brought forward. I think his first work started to come out around 1840, 1850.
Yeah, I think so. I know On Liberty came out about I think 1857. So his earlier works on that, like on political economy, on that probably been around 1840 or so.
Mm-hmm. So I guess we've talked about politics, we talked about argumentation, we talked a little bit about his stances on utilitarianism. What would you say of his stances economically?
If I had to base it on just what I've read and what I know right now, I'd say he's probably a pretty well free marketeer, because he said so many times that like the only reason you should infringe on someone else's liberty is if they're infringing on your own, and that the people in authority shouldn't be trying to basically make their ideas unquestionable, because if you don't question an idea, then it doesn't become absolute truth. It becomes a dead dogma. And so I would think that he'd be a free marketeer more so than anything, especially since 100 years earlier, Adam Smith, or just critiqued the mercantilist system at the time.
Mm-hmm. You see, I sort of agree, but there's also some of his stuff in some of the essays he had on economics and society that were almost counterintuitive, I guess you could say. I mean, I guess it might tie into his utilitarianism a little bit better, but he was one for free markets, at least, like you said, to my understanding as well, that a lot of his arguments did lean towards the free market concept. However, he also agreed with certain things like, I remember seeing this and just thinking it was kind of a weird crossover. He was against the idea of progressive taxation, and even went as far as to call it a mild form of robbery, because it penalized people who had earned more or worked harder or in some way, shape, or form had come out ahead. He didn't like the idea that it penalized them for that. But on the flip side, he was 100% on board with inheritance taxes. So he was okay with the idea of taxing inheritances, simply because receiving an inheritance would put someone that much farther ahead. So I found that some of those things kind of countered themselves a little bit. I don't know if maybe you have a different approach on that based on his utilitarianism.
No, I think that's always the lens you have to look through on John Stuart Mill stuff. Is like he's trying to think what will bring the greatest amount of happiness to the greatest amount of people. So like for that argument, he probably thought that taxing someone's income was probably bring less happiness as opposed to taxing someone's gathered wealth, because he probably felt that money had come from family gathering the long sort of time. It didn't actually come from that person's labor. So just trying to think of a utilitarian empiricist argument, that's probably where he came from. And then later in his life, he did kind of move towards more almost socialistic policies. I think just because he's developing his own philosophy and becoming more so just aware of like how governments like tyrannize women and minorities. And like, so he's just trying to figure out, okay, what can I do to make sure that these people who have had these wrongs done to them, like have them right, and then there's more happiness for the more amount of people. So I guess almost in that sense, the rich would be a minority, so having their wealth passed around would be, happiness for more people as opposed to less. So that's kind of one of the flaws, though, of utilitarianism is though, like, though that may make more people happy, you're still kind of taking that from people who they may have earned that. They may have not just gotten it from family. They may have, started from rags to riches.
Mm. Yeah, it's one of the issues I've always had with pure utilitarian arguments is the line that you have to draw, and where exactly you need to draw that line of how much ill you can do against the one for the sake of the many. At some point or another, the line does have to be drawn for utilitarianism. And I find that no matter how definitive of a system of ethics you have, it's very difficult to, with any kind of certainty, draw that type of definitive line.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why I almost think of utilitarianism as just a tool to use when a principled approach doesn't work, like when the issue is no longer black and white. That's when you start using utilitarian methods, because there's, like I said, there's got to be a line drawn, and I've drawn my line. And if my line just doesn't make sense anymore, that's when I might start thinking, okay, how's this going to affect people? How's this going to bring happiness to the most amount of people? And just try to look at it more empirical than I would.
Mm-hmm. And it's a good thing too, because, and this is something that I personally find is so rare inside libertarian debate, or inside of just liberty debates in general, is the fact that so much of it ignores the consequentialism of it. A lot of it works purely in those principled territories, the whataboutisms, the Ancapistans,
the deontology.
The a priori arguments that are supported by other a priori arguments. Mill's kind of shucked that aside and said, okay, this is what the impact will look like. This is what we are aiming for. This is how it will look. This is how people will feel. This is the good that it will bring. Let's try this. And again, you can agree or disagree with some of the arguments that he put forward, but at least his intentions were always clear, and they were grounded in the real world.
Yeah, he's very much like Aristotle in that respect, where he tries to take observations of what's going on around him to make sense of everything. He doesn't try to create, his theory of the forms or this very abstract explanation for things. He tries to take observation for everything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess since we're coming up a little bit on our time here, I'll ask one last question of you here before we wrap up. If there's one key takeaway from the works of Mill's, if there's one key concept that you think that anyone who's looking at his works or even might have mildly heard his name, one key thing that they should take away from it, what do you think that should be?
Honestly, I think the biggest takeaway that would work for everyone of every ideology, of every belief system, is just that your idea is not going to be an absolute truth until you have it challenged, until you have other people try to refute it. Because the more you try to prevent people from debunking your idea because you think it'll harm it, the more it's just going to become dogma.
Mm-hmm. That I couldn't agree more with. An idea is only worth the weight that it can hold when it's actually being challenged. Otherwise, it's just a thought that's out there in the air. It needs that challenge, that debate, that discourse to actually lead it towards some form of truth. We're going to cut the episode there, though, just before a whole bunch of skeptics start attacking me for mentioning the T word. Luke, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on. I'm definitely going to have you on again. I've already mentioned the book at the beginning there. Is there anything else you wanted to mention before we close things up?
Just if you want to follow me, my writings are on Being Libertarian, Think Liberty, and antiwar.com. You can follow me at Luke Henderson, author and journalist on Facebook. Beautiful.
And you can follow us on pretty much all forms of social media, myself included on Facebook under Killian Hobbs -- author there. You can listen to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You know the websites you can visit. Again, Luke, it was an absolute pleasure having you on. And as always, if you liked what you heard and you'd like to hear more, I'll see you again next week.